Hello, folks. My name is David Mackay. I'm the Deputy Managing Editor of the National Observer, Canada's National Observer, and I am very pleased to be with you all today. I have with me Marin, Dale, and Anne Raphael, three very smart people who have lots of really interesting things to say, and I'm eager to get to what they have to say. We will have, I want to keep this as a very informal conversation. Think about, being around the kitchen table and just talking about this enormous issue, which is our climate crisis and what we have to do with it from a global perspective, but also from a personal perspective as well. Like, what personal responsibilities do we have going forward? Because that's what it really comes down to. It's fine for the leaders at COP26 to talk about some of really, really big issues. But at the end of the day, it's what do we do personally in terms of the cars we drive, in terms of what we do with our garbage, in terms of how we heat our homes, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully we can kind of boil it down to that. And then when at the end of this discussion, we can really think about that. So with that, I'm going to throw it open to our panelists. And Marin, why don't we start with you? So just give us a short introduction, tell us who you are, and tell us a little bit about why this issue is important to you and where you're coming from.
My name's Marin Smith. I'm the Executive Director and founder of Clean Energy Canada. So we're a think tank based at Simon Fraser University, and we work to accelerate the transition to a clean energy economy in Canada. I also co-chair the BC government's Climate Solutions Council. We've been advising the government on how to develop their roadmap to 2030. And I would just give a plug for that. Stay tuned pre-COP for some great, interesting climate announcements out of BC. And what motivates me about this is, I'm all about solutions, and I feel like the climate crisis is so, real, so urgent. Our kids and our kids' kids are going to live in a very different world because of it. And I'm just so motivated to do something about it, but I feel like we have the solutions. Many of the solutions are ready, and it's really, people and government's inability to move quickly on these things and to adopt change and transition to new ways. That's the biggest obstacle for us in the climate crisis. I think that we can change, which is what makes me optimistic. So I think that gives you a little bit of a frame about why I'm excited about this.
Great. Anna Raphael, do you want to jump in?
Hi, everyone. Very happy to be on this panel today. As David mentioned, my name is Anne Raphael Audouin, and I'm the President and CEO of Water Power Canada, which is the national organization that represents all the hydropower generators and their suppliers of goods and services here in Canada. Before Water Power Canada, I was working for Hatch, an engineering consulting firm, working on environmental and social impacts management on national and international projects. I think what motivates me is very similar to what Marin said, and I think everyone would say the same thing who's working in that space. It goes beyond the personal commitment, right? It's about the generational aspect of what we're doing and trying to leave a legacy that is positive, as opposed to something that is going to be a burden for our children to carry forward. So I'm a mom of two young kids, and I know that they already care, they're 3 years old and just under, and they already understand the concept of the beauty of nature and the importance of preserving, our natural wealth. Mm-hmm. So I've been working in this natural resources sector for close to 15 years and focused on sustainability, climate action, and now more and more on the role that renewables can and will play in the future.
Mm-hmm. Dale.
Thanks, David. So I'm Dale Bugin. I'm the Vice President of Research and Analysis at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. It's a bit of a mouthful. So the Institute is a federally funded but fully independent research organization. And essentially, we bring together experts from across the country, whether they are academics or practitioners. They all come looking to contribute good evidence, good research, and good policy advice to governments across the country on climate change, whether that is adapting to a changing climate or reducing emissions or finding pathways to prosperity and well-being, even in the face of those big changes from climate change policy, from climate change itself. So we've put out work on the cost of climate change for Canada, on pathways to net zero, released a paper today actually on the implications of global transitions, of what the rest of the world's move towards low carbon means for the risks and opportunities for Canada. So we'll touch on maybe all of that a little bit today as we get into it.
Yep.
In terms of what motivates me, I mean, the stakes are so high for this issue. And it's not just about preventing climate change or adapting to climate change. It really is about pathways to prosperity across the whole country. And my economist instincts take me towards ideas about growth and progress. But that isn't just some abstraction. Those ideas of growth and prosperity have really human implications for the people implicated in these transitions across the country, for sectors, for regions, in the entirety of the country. And because those stakes are so high, this issue is so important that we get those policies right. And that's what motivates me.
All right, I'm going to kick things off with some questions here. And so the way this is going to work is I'm going to ask our very smart people here a couple of questions just to kick off a conversation. And then we have some questions that some folks had sent into us ahead of time. And then hopefully if we have time, we can ask some questions that you folks might have. We can monitor the chat. And then at the end of it, we're going to leave about 10, 15 minutes for our guests to talk about some takeaways. That is, what are some of the concrete things that we can all do, all of us, when we leave this and we go forth into the world. So yeah, it's going to be a really fun hour. Maren, I wanted to start with you. So with COP26 just around the corner and a newly reconfirmed federal government committing to set the country on a net zero emissions path by 2050, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what you think our remaining challenges are to address climate change in a meaningful way.
Well, that's no small question.
I know, it's a big one. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's throw out a bit of context here. You know, things have changed significantly over the last couple of years. And just to get people's heads there, in 2019, there were no countries that had committed to be net zero. It's 2021, there's now 137 countries that represent 70% of global GDP, that's trillions of dollars, who have committed that their economies will be net zero, have zero emissions by 2050. This is huge in terms of the scale of transition and the level of commitment. Now, you know, the thing that's the opportunity here is we're going to be addressing climate change. To get to net zero, we are going to be transitioning off of fossil fuels and into clean energies and low carbon goods and services. And that's what these countries are going to be looking for. And so for Canada, this actually provides a huge opportunity because we are a country, and I'm sure we'll drive into this more, but it's got 83% zero emission electricity right now. And if we started plugging it into our economy, we could be producing low carbon goods and services. So huge opportunity for jobs, for the economy. And I would say the first challenge is that Canadians don't see climate action as an opportunity, as something that we're going to gain jobs and investments and business opportunities. We think of it as pain, and it's all about, what's the cost going to be and what's the impact on me? How's my life going to not be as good because I'm having to take climate action? So I'd say the first challenge is for Canada to actually wrap its head around the huge advantage, the huge opportunity of this energy transition. Obviously we're a country that's an oil and gas nation that exports a lot of goods and services, and that's what we're used to. So this is going to mean change, but it doesn't mean that it's going to make our economy worse. We do need a transition plan for workers. But there is going to be plenty of jobs, and we'll dive into that. So then I'll get to your question, like what are the big challenges for Canada? The first is actually wrapping our head around the scale of the change and the opportunity. The second is us actually acting quickly, because our processes, we tend to do a good thing, which was we talk a lot amongst ourselves, but we are a bunch of provinces and cities with a national government, and it takes us a long time to get things going. That's going to be our next challenge. And then concretely, a quarter of Canada's emissions come from oil and gas. This government actually committed to put a cap on the oil and gas emissions and then to start to ratchet them down. That would be a first. Our oil and gas emissions have only been going up with 5-year milestones. That's, I would say the first challenge for Canada to get that moving for this government. The second is transportation. That's a second quarter of our emissions. Between those two sectors, that's half of Canada's emissions. And our transportation emissions have been growing as well. We drive the most polluting cars of any nation in the world.
Wow.
We are driving the trucks and SUVs that we've been convinced that we need. The auto sector is going to try to be dumping those into Canada because we're convinced that we need them. And they're shifting to electric vehicle manufacturing, and those are going to go to other countries. So putting in place the commitments that the government said that we were going to hit 50% zero emission vehicle sales by 2030, that's going to require a tool like a zero emission vehicle standard or mandate. They committed to do something like that. So getting that in place quickly is going to be, I'd say, one of the challenges, and not just for passenger vehicles. That'll be the first thing, but then it's the trucks and buses. The exciting thing about these is they're ready for prime time. They, not the long haul trucks, but for the smaller trucks, those are coming online over the next few years, and they're coming down in price and being cost competitive. So again, great opportunity, and we get better air quality out of it. Mm-hmm. And the third big challenge that I would name just to kick us off here is electricity. The government committed to put in place clean electricity, to hit net zero electricity by 2035. But as we also shift off of fossil fuels, we're going to be plugging our transportation and our industry and our home heating and cooling into electricity. We are going to need 2 to 3 times the amount of electricity that we have today. So we have a great starting point, but actually getting that electric grid in place is going to be, I would say, one of the biggest challenges for this country, in particular, where provinces, utilities, the federal government, cities, those aren't a crew of people that necessarily are great at sitting down and making action plans and moving forward quickly. And they're going to need to do that if we're going to succeed here.
Well, that's great. So that allows me to dovetail to Dale. So Dale, what do you think? Do you think that Canada can meet its 2050 net zero target? And second of all, what do you think will be needed to get there, and what can renewables offer in that context?
So me and my team, we are the geeks and nerds of the climate policy world, and we have actually tackled this question in previous research. Earlier this spring, we released a report answering exactly that, of pathways to net zero. And we used a big economic model of the entire economy, so that made sure we weren't just inventing magical unicorn paths to net zero, but actually real, credible, serious pathways that were internally consistent, that had a connection from here to there. And here's what we found. So we actually ran 60 different scenarios, exploring all possibilities under different assumptions, and a few things popped out. We found that by 2030, to get to the 2030 target, the most important thing was what we called safe bet technologies that are already available, already commercialized, and they show up again and again and again across all of those 60 scenarios. That's things like energy efficiency, it's things like electric vehicles, it's things that we already are aware of and are starting to take up, but have more to do. To drive those safe bets, we need kind of incremental, steady, increasingly stringent policy. We need carbon pricing. We need flexible regulations like the vehicle standards that Marin is talking about. We need to change the incentives and get the system deploying those existing technologies. By 2050, the story is a bit different. To get to 2050, you can do it with mostly safe bets, but it sure is a lot easier if some of the wild cards, as we call them, are also available. That's some of these game-changing technologies that might change a lot of things in our energy system, but they also might not play out. They may not come to commercialization. So there are wildcards that are possible all through the economy, whether it is air capture technologies to pull out emissions from the atmosphere and store them permanently, whether it is small modular nuclear to contribute to electricity, whether it's geothermal electricity. Those kind of additional technologies can be possible, but they aren't a guarantee. So you don't want to go all in. You don't want to put all your chips onto those wild cards and hope and pray, but that you do want to dedicate a little bit of your attention to them to make sure that they can happen. So that takes you to other kinds of policy. It takes you to laying some bets in trying to drive those innovation, trying to enable the deployment and the development of those new technologies. One last thing to the story, and that is today's report, because across all of this is factors that Canada doesn't control. Not all the levers are under our knobs and dials. What happens in the rest of the world has a big implication here. Is there going to be ongoing demand for oil and gas as the rest of the world transitions? What is going to be the constraints on markets in terms of the carbon intensity and carbons embedded in different goods? Those things pose both big risks and big opportunities for Canadian firms. So it's not just about getting to net zero. It's also making sure that we can do that in a prosperous way. We need to find not just protecting the old sources of growth in the country, but generating new sources of economic growth and prosperity as well. So that's part of that wildcard challenge as well.
All right. And Rafael, we talked a lot about the importance of a mix of technologies. And I'm wondering what you think that we need to unlock new possibilities for our country and what these possibilities look like. For example, when we talk about new tech, we're talking about green hydrogen, pumped storage, et cetera. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think that's a perfect segue from what Maren, said, and then Dale talked about just now. So, look, I mean, I think we'll agree that we have very ambitious targets, and ultimately, this could create the right environment for ambitious action. But what we don't have yet is how we're going to bridge the gap between those ambitious targets and the tangible action. So if I speak from my own industry, the hydropower sector generates more than 90% of Canada's renewable electricity, 90. So that's huge. And 60% of the country's total electricity comes from hydropower. So the sector and the role it plays in ensuring that Canada's grid is as clean as it is very, very significant. But yet, with all the almost 85,000 megawatt of installed hydropower that we have, we could still more than double that installed capacity through refurbishment of the existing fleet and a number of new developments, such as pumped storage hydro. So there is a lot of opportunity to generate more clean electricity in Canada. That's not the problem. So just to answer your question, trying to find more clean electricity is not going to be a problem in Canada. We have an abundance of renewables ready in the starting blocks, ready to play a huge role. But I'll tell you that it almost doesn't matter how much hydro, wind, or solar power you have and you can generate if electricity doesn't increase, electricity demand doesn't increase through the electrification of our economy, and if we actually don't achieve our GHG emission reduction targets. Mm-hmm. So in my view, that's really the $1 million or the $1 trillion question that underpins this whole discussion on clean transition, is how are we going to give investors, private and public sector, enough signals and certainty that electricity demand is going to increase so that we can unlock those new opportunities that you were asking in your question. And for hydro, I'll give you one final example. We actually don't build for projected load increase above and beyond a very small margin of growth. And people don't tend to do that. They think about electrification, we've got a climate action plan, let's go, it's showtime. Well, it doesn't work that way. The doubling or tripling of the electricity demand that the federal action plan calls for is not reflected in any of the market regulators' forecast. And hence, no one is going to be able to, or allowed to, or motivated to build more until we have a clear and certain path forward. So really, I see the targets as, talking the talk, and it's great. We're lucky again to live in a country where we do have that ambition, but embedding future forecast of electricity demand growth into our market dynamic is what's required to now walk the talk.
I'd like to have a follow-up question, and I want to pivot back to Maren. So, people tend to assume that clean energy won't solve our climate challenge, that it's too intermittent, that it's too expensive, not available across all regions. I mean, we can think of all kinds of reasons. And I'm wondering how you address that, what you have to say about that.
I say I've got good news, like welcome to 2021. That's really an old narrative that you're talking about. When it comes to cost, the cost of solar have dropped 82% over the past decade. The cost of wind has dropped 40%. And globally, renewable energy, solar, wind, are cheaper than fossil fuels in the majority of places. So I would say in Canada, we have the same situation where you can build solar and wind. In Alberta, for example, is coming in at cheaper than fossil fuel electricity. Things have really changed on that front. When it comes to intermittency, think of the old, Windows 2.0 or something like that. That's the old narrative. And now look at where we are today when it comes to technology. So battery technologies have come a huge way over the past decade. So I'll use an example, a place like South Australia. They get 62% of their electricity from wind and solar. They have battery storage to back it up. They have had, in the last 5 years, not 1 hour has the electricity been not being supplied. Not 1 hour. I live here in British Columbia, and I know that we have electrical outages from time to time. I think we do in other places in Canada. So storage has really, it's one of the new exciting areas. The prices of renewables have dropped and storage technologies have developed, whether it's batteries, that we talked about a bit, or it's green hydrogen. People are using electricity, converting it into hydrogen, which is another fuel source, and that's called green hydrogen because it's being produced with zero emission electricity and can be used to fuel things that can't run on electricity. So long haul trucks, for example, and they're looking at how can you use that in things like cement and steel manufacturing, these things that electricity just won't get the temperatures hot enough for, and compressed air. So the United States, the United States, Australia are a couple of places where over the next year or two, I think we're going to see massive improvements in storage technologies that are being developed there. They're already being used, but the prices are dropping. Canada, we have such a great opportunity. We have BC, Manitoba, and Quebec with these legacy hydro projects that act as giant batteries. Most countries in the world would be thrilled to have the kind of electric grid that we have here. And again, if we could really work together more collaboratively, so we could link up BC and Alberta, for example, Alberta with all its very powerful wind and solar renewable energy potential with BC's battery legacy hydro. Manitoba can link up with Saskatchewan and Ontario, Quebec with Ontario and the East Coast. So we need to take advantage of these assets and find a way to collaborate and use what we have. So I say right now, I'd say the challenges are the fossil fuel system where we have price spikes like we're seeing right now, and challenges with shortages and price spikes and people not being able to get the energy that they need, whereas clean energy tends to be developed close to where people are. And so it's an energy security issue as well for other countries in the world. We have an abundance, as Anne Raphael said, we have an abundance of energy potential here in Canada. We're very lucky. Okay. So the good news on that front, that's my answer. Good news, costs are down, intermittency, I'm not saying that it's solved 100%, but the technologies are being developed, and in many places we're seeing systems with grid integration that are highly successful.
Okay. Dale, so, new reports are suggesting that if we electrify our economy and meet the 2030, 2050 climate targets and increase in electricity generation by 2 to 3 times will be required. 2 to 3 times. Okay, here's a question for you. Can we do it?
I think, again, the answer is, yeah, we can. And it's partly for the reasons that Raphael and Maren have articulated, but the costs of those technologies are coming down so much. Like there's still work ongoing on this, including some in my shop about exactly the way this will play out and exactly how to do it. But the big picture here is that because clean electricity from wind and solar and backstopped by some of those storage and firm power options that Maren talked about is so much cheaper now than it was, that even building out that big new electricity system that's aligned with a net zero system isn't necessarily going to cause big rate spikes because the power is so cheap. There's still complicated conversations about how we're sharing around those fixed and variable costs in utility jargon, about how they're being passed on to consumers and how they're being funded. And certainly building that big system still is a challenge. There's still live questions that Raphael alluded to about coordinating utilities and regulators and getting that system working both within regions as well as between regions. There's lots of policy lifting to do to make sure that system can point in the right direction and unlock some of those solutions. But I'm optimistic that it is possible. And I'm optimistic that the demand side shifts that are going to happen to drive that increased need for supply are going to happen too. We're already seeing shifts towards heat pumps for buildings, heating. We're seeing shifts to electric vehicle. We need both sides of that story to kick in as well. The last thing I'll say there is that we do need to be careful, right? We need to be making sure that we're building our new sources of energy supply in parallel with phasing out our old sources of energy supply. The energy spikes we're seeing right now are possible kind of volatility in these systems, are ways in which the road could be bumpy and which there are mismatches. So we need to be continuing to push on those policy levers to deploy those solutions in as cost-effective a way as we can.
Okay, and last question to you, Anna Raphael, in this first section here, and there's a lot of positive energy. Maybe pun intended, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what gives you the most hope for the future as you kind of look forward, look towards the challenges that we have. Like, what you get the most excited about?
So the challenges are huge. So let's start with that. And everybody alluded to this already in the first portion of our discussion. But as Dale just said, there are also tremendous reasons to be optimistic. So what gives me hope is that there is an increasing number of people around the world who are taking action to address climate change. And so the climate change skepticism that maybe at one point was maybe a 50-50, right, globally many decades ago, now it's, those voices are becoming quite isolated. So that gives me hope that the whole world is really gathering around the notion of urgency. And I happen to work in the renewable generation sector, which is obviously just a sliver of climate action. It's one very important segment, but there are many other things that we do, and tremendous work still to be done to address all the harm that we've done over, decades and decades to our planet, and tackle, air, land, and ocean pollution. So that gives me hope. I'm also invigorated to see that the high-tech private sector is directing more and more, capital to clean projects, electing to power, for example, data centers with hydropower, and powering other projects with wind and solar and storage and batteries. That's encouraging to see that kind of development. And I'll also point out that last week, as most of people listening today would know, our finance system through Canada's 6 largest banks committed to steer lending away from fossil fuels toward renewable energy investments. So by joining this, I think it's called the Net Zero Banking Alliance, it's effectively the Canadian banking system saying that they're going to shift their lending and the way they do business away from projects and activities that generate greenhouse gases emissions and align with pathways to net zero. So this, of course, is a major development, and it's a major encouragement for the renewable sector in Canada. And Finally, I think I'll say that I'm encouraged that the renewable sector itself is reinventing how we operate. For hydro, we're optimizing our fleet, we're taking advantage of digitalization and basically any other new operating systems that we can put in our existing fleet to squeeze as many clean megawatts as we can from that existing fleet. And investing in green hydrogen too. Green hydrogen is going to be big, and hydropower is one of the best pathways to make it a viable commercial reality very soon. Mm-hmm. So we do have all those opportunities, and that's going to help us write the next chapter. And those are real tangible actions that are being undertaken now. But none of this really will happen in a sustained manner if we don't take bold actions and if we start, kind of yesterday, right?
Yeah. Okay. We're about halfway through our discussions. I told you guys this would go quickly. So what we're going to do is spend the next few minutes taking some questions that we got from our audience a day or two ago. And then what I'll do is I will read those questions to you and just invite all of you just to jump in with your answers, and then we can go to the next one. Okay. So I'll go to the first question, and the first question is from Tom McLean. Tom writes, "It is now cheaper to produce clean energy using renewable energy than burning coal. In fact, the cost of solar and wind continue to drop rapidly. Why is Canada continuing to invest in expensive and unpromising technologies such as CCUS and nuclear rather than ramping up investments in renewables?" All right. So who wants to tackle that one first?
I'll take a shot if it's okay, David.
Okay, go ahead.
I mean, I think there's lots of barriers to overcome, and that's part of what policymakers are thinking about. But here's one that I think about a lot, and it's this idea of certainty, of policy certainty, because I spent a lot of my time on, say, carbon pricing, which, as you know, changes the incentives. It makes clean things less expensive relative to more emissions intensive things. But it's not just the carbon price today that matters. It's the carbon price at the end of a project that matters, over the life of that project. So the real question is, does the market, do consumers, do firms really believe that the price of carbon is going to rise to $170 per ton, as the federal government says it will? And there's reasons why they might doubt. They may doubt the conviction of politicians, or they may doubt the fact that this government's going to stay in power for that entire time, and it may be swings. So this question of certainty matters a lot for investors who are thinking about really long-lived projects, including big power projects. So they're hedging against the possibility that there'll be policy reversals. So the answer to that problem isn't straightforward. It's partly about kind of building even broader, more solid support behind sensible climate change policy. But it's also about maybe the financial markets getting involved and ensuring some of these projects can make sense, and taking on some of the risk and sharing that risk with government about the possibilities for changing policy and changing incentives. But the more that capital markets and investors start to really buy in and demonstrate that they believe that shift is coming, the more we're likely to cross that inflection point where really cost will tell the story and the question's right.
Who else wants to jump in?
Well, I'll just throw in Dale's done a good job. But I would say, it's in part that Canada hasn't caught up with where the global economy is going, because we've got a pretty strong, stable economy, and we've, spent the last century being a resource extraction-based economy, and that's the mental model that we have to work with. I don't think the country has the economic forecasting that's looking, based on all this commitment to net zero and what that means for low carbon goods and services and clean energies. We haven't, our economic systems, like our ministries of finance, actually I'm finding are more ministries of the budget. And the budget thinks in a 3 to 5 year cycle, whereas we need to be forecasting out 10, 20, 30 years. What are the industries that are going to be growing and that we want to invest in now, so that, we've got good, strong, batteries, hydrogen, these new things that aren't even aren't even on the radars of our Ministry of Finance. And what are the industries that are going to be declining? And let's stop investing in those, because we can see that trajectory, but things have been changing so quickly. I don't think that our governments have actually responded to that. And even, people like Dale and I who work in think tanks, we are trying to get that type of information out there so that we can start investing and getting our governments. I've been saying this all year. We need to think about what's going to be growing in 2030 and 2040 and invest in those, and what's declining, and stop giving those tax breaks and reducing their royalties, etc.
Aaron, you should read our new report that's out today. It answers exactly that question. Stress tests the economy about where there are upswings and downswings in the face of global changes.
Yeah, read it.
Jump in.
I'll just jump in here. I agree with everything that's being said, but also my heart, feels for the pain of the oil and gas sector to a certain degree, because it's been a nation building sector, right? And so I'm always careful not to rain on their parade too much, because they have provided for Canada the economy we know today. Everything we have today was built thanks to that sector. So it's also hard to kind of point fingers and not recognize that they've been contributing a lot to our economy for many, many decades. So I think the person who asked the question was talking about carbon capture and sequestration. And I do think, I agree with Marin, we need to transition, and we need to look at obsolete sectors and start transitioning, hopefully towards, for example, more renewable investment and more clean energy transition. But also I think investing in making existing sectors cleaner. So CCS is promising to me, because if we could get to a place where natural gas generation is actually cleaner and cleaner, it's good news. It's good news for everybody. And so that kind of investment actually, I think, does have a place in the discussion of the clean transition, but it's not where we're going to put all our eggs in that basket, right? It just has to be a suite of solution. But to answer that question in particular, I think we can't completely write it off the solution.
And we are actually getting lots of questions in our chat here, so I want to sprinkle in one or two of those as well. So this question is from Alan's, and please forgive me if I hope I'm pronouncing your last name properly, Slavin. So David, you began by saying it comes down to personal choices, but we live in a society where we have limited choices until governments provide them. If we live in Alberta, we can't switch to carbon-free electricity. We can't use EVs in major areas of Canada because the rechargers aren't there. The decrease in personal travel, et cetera, cost over the last COVID year has had almost no impact on global emissions. We have to leave the responsibility with government regulations, not personal actions. So I'm wondering if you can kind of address that. When we come to personal choices, does it almost depend on where we live in this country as to what we can do?
I can kick us off on that one. I agree with Alan. Yeah. If you look at the analysis, 80% of this is a systems problem that is government that needs to make those decisions around infrastructure. 80% of your emissions that you as a person emit, 20% are what people can actually change. So yes, the biggest thing that you could do is make your voice heard. I know that we all say this and have for decades, but letters to the editor, letters to government, those things actually are useful, inspiring them to take action more urgently. But as an individual, just so you know, anywhere in this country, if you drive an electric vehicle, your emissions will be lower than if you drove a gas-powered vehicle. So even in places like Alberta or Saskatchewan that still have more fossil fuels on the grid, your emissions will be lower. The other things that you can do are some of the electricity suppliers allow you, I know in BC, Fortis does this, where you can pay extra and get renewable gas, thus inspiring the market to shift faster than it's planning to renewable electricity. Or I think Bullfrog still operates where you can do that with your electric power as well. And the thing that I would say is that in most places in the country, there's an affordability piece of this as well. As we're talking about inflation, and affordability has been a big conversation, is that shifting to electricity for a vehicle, once you get over the hump, because for sure you have to go buy a whole new car. There's very few used ones on the market. But once you've got that investment made, you're going to be saving, in BC, it's about $900 a year if you drive 10,000 kilometers just on your fuel costs by shifting to electric. And then there's your maintenance bills, which are lower. So there's good reasons to do this. We could get into the details of shifting to heat pumps, shifting off of natural gas.
I agree with Maren. I mean, the reality is going to be very different, and how much you support, fossil fuels versus renewables is going to obviously be a very different answer if you're from Alberta or Saskatchewan, or if you're from Quebec or BC. Now, from my own, sector, and from the hydropower view, what's interesting is that, for example, pump storage hydro is becoming very, very hot, right? We're seeing quite a few pump storage hydro development across Canada. And guess where some of those projects are actually being developed right now? In Alberta. And they're not small, we're talking several hundred megawatts of installed capacity for those pump storage hydro. And some of them are using decommissioned mines to use the elevation they need in the closed loop pump storage hydro model that they're going to develop. So I think just that kind of story needs to be told to people, that it's not because you've been living this reality for decades that you're stuck with it. Change is possible. And by the way, there is a legacy. There's always something positive out of something that's being built, and that's been an engine economically, socially for a province. Now we just need to enable that transition. And so in provinces that are not maybe very rich in hydropower resources, the good news is that either they have neighbors that are, and as Maren said earlier in the discussion, interties are going to be, by definition, defining a new reality for the grid in the years to come. And also, renewables are abundant everywhere. We just need to unlock those possibilities. We need to be a bit creative and ensure that people know what that means, and that renewables are going to be great news for the electricity bill of many Canadians. The provinces in Canada where you have the most hydro, legacy existing hydro, are the provinces where you pay the least, for your electricity rates as a consumer. That's BC, Quebec, and Manitoba. So there's a story to be told. And I think, again, it's probably not as well known as we could hope for.
I want to chime in with an economist answer because I agree with Alan too that this is fundamentally, you need policy drivers, but you also want policy drivers that leave room for flexibility and leave room for personal choice to account for individual circumstances, whether you're in Alberta or in the North or in Quebec. And that's exactly the advantage of carbon pricing, right? You have the choice to how you respond to that price on carbon. Where it makes sense, you change your behavior, you buy an EV, you switch your furnace, you upgrade your insulation to avoid paying that carbon price and save money. Where you don't, then you pay the carbon price, and because those actions are more valuable to you. At the same time, that revenue that's being generated by the tax or the price on carbon and then being returned via checks to households means that under both those circumstances, you're not having your affordability hammered. You can make your choice, but still not have your affordability. And because the price applies to all the emissions almost in the economy, it's also driving those systemic changes that unlock additional ways for you as an individual to avoid paying that carbon price. It creates incentives for more charging stations, for more infrastructure that enable your own personal actions. That's why there's a link between that personal level and the systemic level, and it really does come through smart policy design.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I want to get back to one of the questions that folks wrote in, and then we might have time for another question in the chat, and then I do want to get to the takeaways because we are unfortunately running out of time. Okay, so Nikki, and again, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name, Skews. We urgently and aggressively need to transition to a low carbon energy future, but we need to make sure that we do this without creating environmental disasters. what are some paths toward net zero future while ensuring more responsible mining and circular economy initiatives that respect Indigenous rights and minimize environmental harms? There's a lot to chew on there, I know, but you're smart people. I know you can do it. So, Anne Raphael, why don't you start with this one?
I mean, the first thing that grabs my attention in the question is just the responsible mining, because I used to work in mining. So my mind goes to that first. And of course, I work now in the electricity sector. So just connecting the two is an evidence, like it makes absolute sense. And I don't think Canada needs to get rid of its, extracting expertise in the mining sector. But, if we can plug in clean power, for example, to actually feed the mining new and existing projects, I think that would be probably a virtuous circle, as opposed to something that just continues to be a full, self-fulfilling prophecy of emissions. So there are opportunities just to clean up right there, an emission-intensive sector with cleaner power. And I think obviously no one is looking at having environmental impacts. No one is looking at not being a partner on projects. And I speak on behalf of an industry that tends to build large infrastructure projects. And I'm always, saying, look, people who say that they're advocates for a net zero future, but at the same time, don't recognize or completely cut off the opportunity of building clean, large infrastructure projects are contradictory. And this is not going to get us on the path to success. This is actually going to get us on the path to climate failure if we don't find a way to reconcile still building large clean infrastructure and being environmental stewards and being partners with Indigenous communities who are owners of the land. So it is a key priority, and everything needs to be articulated around those priorities. And I'm encouraged to see that. I think that needle is moving more and more in that direction.
Okay, Maren.
Yeah, well, I would share the concern that Nikki's voiced about the environment and what are going to be the impacts of things like mining, because we are going to need a lot of metal and minerals for this energy transition. We're going to need a lot of steel and cement and just a lot of building infrastructure and batteries. Batteries have rare earth metals and others. So what I'm seeing and what excites me is Europe has come out with their battery strategy. And part of their battery strategy is that they are looking at the entire battery and whether it itself has a environmental and socially responsible component to it. So they're going to have a labeling that the metals and minerals that go into the battery and the whole production of the battery needs to meet a low carbon test and environmental tests. I think we need to do the same thing here in Canada. Canada has been identified as one of the few countries in the world that has all these metals and minerals needed for battery production. So it's a big opportunity for us. And I think it's the moment, because of the demand that's going to be coming, for us to really be able to develop a very rigorous test around the environmental standards and a brand that goes with it that tells consumers, great, you're getting a electric vehicle that's got a responsible mining approach to it. So that's one. The other part of her question was around Indigenous. So again, I see a very interesting opportunity here. If people don't know about a group called Indigenous Clean Energy, ICE, a Canadian group, I love them. They are amazing and are working across the country, working with Indigenous communities, helping train and build capacity and helping communities move forward on clean energy projects. So from them, I get the numbers that there's 197 clean energy projects that have significant First Nation involvement and partnerships that are larger than 1 megawatt across the country. That's pretty good. I know here in BC that a lot of the renewable energy projects, I don't have a percentage, but I know it's the majority of them have Indigenous involvement and partnership in them. And I think this is a reconciliation opportunity. I think this sector is going to grow, and it's a new sector, relatively new, especially wind and solar and some geothermal, some of the other. It is in Indigenous communities, territories, and it's an opportunity to develop real partnerships with Indigenous communities that are interested in this. So that's one of my hopes, is that as we move forward with the energy transition, we can actually link it with some of these other big issues for Canada that we do need to solve. So I think Nikki's named a big challenge, one that needs to get solved, and we definitely don't want solving climate change to result in wrecking the environment.
Yeah.
One of the emerging thrusts in this conversation is actually in the finance world and sustainable finance world. And increasingly that conversation is about metrics for performance, whether it's metrics for products or for firms or for performance of projects even. And the disclosure of those metrics, whether it is vulnerability to climate risk or physical risk, or whether it is carbon intensity, or whether the project is supportive or not of Indigenous rights, whether it has implications for biodiversity. Increasingly, this conversation about what needs to be disclosed includes all of those things. And that creates really interesting opportunities for finance markets to start to think about all of those dimensions explicitly rather than implicitly. And it does also raise policy questions too, because you want those metrics to be disclosed not asymmetrically, not just by some firms who do things really well and not by others who don't. So there's a case for regulating the disclosure of some of these metrics on climate and other environmental dimensions to make sure there's a level playing field, and again, to drive that investment towards projects and firms and products that can be consistent with this net zero future, this prosperous future, but also this fair and equitable future. They all fit together if it's done right.
So we only got about 8 minutes left. Boy, this is really whipping by. I told you it would be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let's squeeze in one last question from the chat, because there's lots of really good stuff here. And then I want to leave about 5 minutes at the end just for a quick whip around in terms of takeaways that people can take away with them. So this question, and again, I need a very quick, precise answer from all of you on this. So the Net Zero Banking Alliance, right, which has made news recently, no enforcement, no accountability. Does just a commitment, does this really mean anything? So who wants to start off with that one?
I can go because I mentioned it earlier.
Okay.
So I think it's aspirational. So it goes in the right direction. Is it the silver bullet that we would want to direct, all decisions toward an increased adoption of behaviors for renewables and clean energy? No, it certainly is weak. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you've got the major banking system. And by the way, it's a United Nations undertaking. So it's not an isolated Canadian initiative. Is powerful because really you're sending the message that people are watching. There's scrutiny now. People are paying attention to how you're spending that money because your shareholders at the end of the day are demanding climate action. They're demanding climate equity. And so the bottom line of, planet, profit people, profit people, planet, however order you have it, people may, organize that differently. But at the end of the day, planet is going to become, alongside people as the very number one item that any private sector company has to really take care of and put all their assets forward for that priority.
Okay. Maren, what do you think? Is it aspirational or is it more than that?
I would say it's aspirational, absolutely, but it sends a signal and an indicator. And there are many, many signals of this net zero. So, whether it's the banking alliance, the countries, et cetera. And I understand the frustration. Like we've missed, all kinds of people have made all kinds of promises and missed those promises. It's, hard not to get dragged down into the despair and hopelessness of this. But again, I think what gives me hope now is that there's I hate to say this, but there's money to be made from this transition. So this is not just a moral imperative and do this because it's the right thing to do. It's now going to be this business proposition. And I think, that's what it's going to take to accelerate things. And I'm glad that we're at that place now, because we need to accelerate enormously and make it so that it's, remove the obstacles for businesses who are trying to move forward with clean energy or zero emission or low carbon types of projects. So aspirational, yes, but a signal and an indicator of where we're going. And I think that if we have this conversation, a year from now or 2 years from now, we're going to see that the business sector is going to be driving this. The government needs to get the right policy in place, but the demand from the business sector is going to be much louder. Whereas what has been in place has been the fossil fuel sector trying to hold us back and restrain us. And I think we're at that tipping point.
Dale.
It's aspirational, but when you combine it with incentives, say carbon pricing and regulations, and with transparency, say mandatory disclosure and product markets, then suddenly it's more than aspirational. Then it is following the exact incentives that Maren is describing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we just got literally 3 or 4 minutes left. So I want to wrap up today, and I'd like each one of you to leave us with, let's say 3 takeaways, 3 positive takeaways that people can walk away with, of things that we can do.
I think I need to repeat. I think one of my takeaways from this is don't lose hope. The worst thing, I think, is if people start to lose hope that it's too late or that it's not going to happen. So keep engaging in these kinds of conversations and learn more. Like this conversation is evolving so quickly. So stay positive. Secondly, even though Alan brought up the fact that taking actions yourself isn't going to fix this, it's majority of it needs to be fixed structurally and infrastructurally, but you can take actions. And it's not just about reducing your emissions, buying an electric vehicle, shifting to a heat pump. And I have to say, I got an electric vehicle and oh my God, they are so fun. Like they just have such takeoff, and I've never really cared about a car before. But there's that, or an electric bike. Get a heat pump and talk to your friends and neighbors about it. That's the impact, is actually getting these things out there so people realize they aren't futuristic. They aren't what they were 10 years ago. These things work, and not only do they work, they're fantastic. Thirdly, my third thing I would say, and I know it's hard to do, but my real fear right now is that it is going to take a level of collaboration that we have never seen in this country between the federal government and the provinces, cities, utilities, the clean tech sector, the industrial sector, indigenous governments, labor, like I could go on and on. It is going to take a level of collaboration and getting over ourselves. Like everyone's got their issues. We need to move quickly. And so just let government know in whatever way you want. Let your voice get out there to encourage them to take leadership and act quickly.
Okay, Dale.
Okay, so like I said, I'm a policy wonk. So for me, this is about policy, and we shouldn't shy away from that. That fundamentally, this is about incentives, it's about transparency, it's about regulations and carbon pricing and disclosure. But that, like Maren says, that has real implications for all of us as individuals. And the way we make space for better policy is that we engage in conversations with our friends, with our neighbors, with our community about good policy. We don't shy away from hard conversations around climate policy, even though it can get political. That's how we make space. And that's how we increase consensus around those bigger, better, more cost-effective policies that can really drive us to a successful 2050 outcome. So it's about talking about policy. It's about supporting governments that have good policy. And I think I'll leave it at that. It's kind of a mishmash of several layers of things rather than 3 distinct things, David. But I think that's the crux of it for me.
Mishmash, I love it. Okay, and Raphael.
I agree with everything that's been said, but I can just add my own spin on it. I think we need to find a way to streamline, regulatory approvals for clean energy projects without, of course, bypassing environmental standards, and that's going to be very important. Hydropower projects can take between 8 and 12 years to get permitted, and of course, with that kind of time frame, forget about us being able to contribute to the 2030 goals and maybe to the 2050, right? So something has to change if we want large infrastructure, clean projects to be contributors to the clean transition. I'd say also that and it's to Marin's point, I think we need to build better public awareness on the urgency of our situation and kind of building this climate ambassador network where people are agents of change. And finally, we got to move from targets to action. Now is the time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, Anna, Raphael, Dale, and Mara, thank you very much. It's been a great conversation. It's gone by way too quickly. Hopefully we can do this again. I would like to urge people to sign up for National Observer's newsletter. It's very good. And between now and COP26, it's already been happening. We've got lots of coverage, so please check it out. There's a lot of really good stuff. And this conversation will be on YouTube, so please stay tuned for that. So listen, I want to thank you guys. It's been a great conversation, and I've got a few of my takeaways as well that I've learned from you guys. So thank you very much for this, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye.